Hi, and welcome to Words That Matter, a modern day book club. And I'm the host, Lee Smith. Thanks so much for being here with us today. We have a really special show, really interesting show, fascinating guest, a gentleman, a financier, but also a man vastly knowledgeable about history, and who's actually engaged in a really important and fascinating project. He and I have spoken about this before, and basically the project is sort of documenting the current moment, our current moment, wholly, and understanding it in historical terms. And eventually, I hope we're going to talk to him and find out if this is true, if he's writing a history of this moment as well. But what he's really thinking about, his model is Thucydides, the great, one of the original historians, along with Herodotus, and of course the Peloponnesian Wars. So welcome, please, the great Adam Townsend. Adam, thank you so much for being here with us today.
And thank you so much for having me here today.
All right, so let's talk about this a little bit. I know I know the first of all, your project is broad and enormous, and Thucydides is broad and enormous. And I know that you want to narrow the scope of our discussion a little bit. But let's start off with what this project is, why Thucydides is important, and what else we need to understand. I know we're getting into all sorts of territory here, and I know we're not going to be able to cover even a fraction of it in the half an hour we have, but let's go. This is going to be a great conversation.
Okay. And that's actually difficult for me to respond to. I'd like to respond to that, but it's so broad. Why do you think Thucydides is important?
Well, I mean, Thucydides is along with Herodotus, one of the fathers of history. And he's explaining what happened at this pivotal moment when Athens lost, Athens forfeited. I wouldn't say lost, I'd say forfeited its democracy. And I'm going to turn it around right back on you. Is that why you're thinking about the current moment in these terms? Do you think that we're forfeiting our own political system, which is hardly exactly like Athenian democracy? But is this what interested you about Thucydides to begin with?
It's what interested me about Thucydides to begin with. So I think it's very difficult to look at Thucydides and try and kind of apply it like onion skin upon kind of the topography of our own times. I don't think that can be done. I think it's exasperating, and it requires a lot of kind of twisting to make it conform to anything that resembles the Hellenic era. I became interested in Thucydides as a kid, and then I forgot about it, right? Because we have the rest of our life to live, right? And then around 2019, I became reinterested in Thucydides in late 2019, but really just kind of more passively, just kind of looking at the whole surface of Thucydides, the whole surface of his work, without kind of any exploration into any of its little kind of intrigues that are within it. In 2020, when COVID was introduced into our society and into our kind of social systems and into the way we speak and the way we interact, and how it was kind of transforming language and words, and then we had, the Black Lives Matter era, right? And, putting aside the social elements of it, right? Because then that I don't want to kind of argue the social qualities of it, whether it's right or wrong or this or that, but just in terms of the brute force of it, and kind of reminded me of Coursera. So in answer,
hold on,
if I could answer your question.
Well, I just want you to very quickly, what is Coursera? I mean, I just want to make sure that all of our, that we're all informed, because there's going to be some time that people will have not have read Thucydides in a while, or maybe not at all. So let's give them the benefit of the.
Okay. Okay, so Coursera is, I think, if I recall correctly now, I think it's book 381 through 87, but approximately like 83 through 87, approximately, right? That's off the top of my head. Okay.
That's good. All right.
Coursera was a civil war, and there was a civil war that was raging throughout the entire Hellenic world. And Coursera is probably only about 4 pages. The conflicts within Coursera, that civil war that was raging, Thucydides describes it very elegantly, very economically. It's only 4 pages long, but it's mind blowing. It's absolutely mind blowing because he describes kind of the tumult, this kind of twist and this violent kind of contortions of society in such a way that I feel that we're living it now. So it's interesting because there are several books, if this is a book thing, right? So I'll discuss that have kind of had a significant impact on my life. And one of them was Letters to Lucilius from Seneca, where I felt I was kind of encountering my long lost father and the advice that my long lost father would be giving me. And because it just seems so kind of real, it seems so now, it seems so current to me. And there are parts of Thucydides, including, in his description of the Civil War, that just seem so current, where I can see it now. And the book is not entirely about war. It's about the behaviors that drove the conflict and the war. And it's about the kind of political and domestic, the intrigues of war. And so his book was kind of written for all of time. And I do consider myself somewhat Thucydides. That's a horrible thing for me to say because it's so vainglorious that I say that kind of smirking inside because I know it's not true. But it's simple to say, so I'll say it simply. And because these times need
It's important to have good models. It's important to have very good models. So I think that's okay. I'm happy you say that.
Well, so the important thing I think is one of the things that I learned very quickly in watching kind of COVID and the hysteria, and I was against the COVID tyranny literally from the day it began, which was January 23rd, January 24th, 2020 is when those videos dropped on Twitter, right? And all of a sudden we saw all these leaked videos of people collapsing, and I was certain that it wasn't real, and it looked to me very similar to what China had done earlier with the Olympics. Remember that they had used the Olympics. They had used all that kind of industrial activity to cloak the construction of new camps and new internment facilities. And they had done the same thing for the World's Fair, right? For their own kind of World's Fair, how they had used that activity to kind of cloak their own thing. But so most importantly, I think Thucydides, going back to that, right, is important because we all, and I include you within this, so you're part of the all, we all have to learn how to tell ourselves this story, right? So Thucydides is important because he conceived of a way to tell a story, to tell a very sweeping, very highly complex story, and narrow it down to not just kind of its narrative structure, but what he decided to include with it. The speeches that he kind of embellished are very important, and he acknowledges embellishing them. But because what's very important is we learn how to tell ourselves this story of what's going on. We are living in kind of a carcera ourselves, right? But we're living in such a time of disequilibrium, of emotional, of intellectual, of academic, of societal disequilibrium and distortions. We have to learn how to tell ourselves this story.
I love this idea.
How do I explain to myself? How do I explain to myself what's going on? How can I tell myself this story? Biden is screwing things up. Now, somebody might believe that, so I'm not going to argue. I'm just going to use that as a statement and throw it out into the wild. If somebody believes, so most people will look at kind of what's going on in society, and they'll try and sum it up. They'll try and make it this kind of cognitive postage stamp, right? And that's dangerous, right? We try and abbreviate things to. We try and we have been instructed and conditioned to have discourse with ourself, which is ourselves as kind of the stupidest person in the room, right? We have to learn how to have true quality discourse with ourselves, which means that we have to have the language, we have to have the ideas, we've got to elevate things. So if we want to talk about how to repair a society and how to have this renewal of a society, we also need the language for that. And we need to be able to have that discourse first with ourselves. So I think Thucydides is extremely important because his history tells us how we can explain our own history to ourselves. How do I explain what's going on now? Well, I can just say something like, well, Biden is screwing things up and here and here. I can even get a little bit more complex and into the weeds, but that doesn't do a very good job of explaining the entire system of a thing, of the way the pieces interact with each other, the way they engage with each other. And that's something that Thucydides did very, very well. It's the Millennium Dialogues, and it's everything where he takes a very complex system, right? And very complex conflicts that were going on, that were life and death conflicts. And he kind of examines it in 360. And that's something we have to teach ourselves how to do. So Thucydides is important, just as Machiavelli is important, because it gives us the language. We all think we're very smart, right? All of us have such a high elevated opinion of ourselves. But then if I was to assign somebody homework and say, well, write down, what you think of COVID tyranny or that era, they couldn't do it. They think they could because all the thoughts in their head are so brilliant and so remarkable, but they find that those thoughts can't cross the transom so that it makes sense to other people. So you first have to learn how to explain it to yourself so that it can cross the transom, because we need to rebuild society. But we can't rebuild society unless we have the language, the discourse, the intellectual capacity, and the history to do it. That's it. That's my Thucydides spiel.
That's amazing. I love that idea. And this is what you learned from Thucydides, and you think that others can learn as well. I mean, it's fantastic. It's a remarkably complex time. It's a remarkably complex. Well, is it a very complex time, or is actually every time hugely complex? And some of them, but the times that will always seem most complex are the times that we are living in, the times that we are trying to explain, as you say to yourselves. So, is this particular moment especially complicated?
Yes.
The one that we're living in, not necessarily Thucydides.
Yes. I'm going to ask you a question. Okay. You're familiar with the Hellenic Civil War and the Athenian Civil Wars, of course, right? Perhaps, maybe not, of course, but I'm certain you are, because of your own interest in the tyrants of that era and kind of the political operating system and the transformations that occurred in a very short, brief amount of time in that period. So, how did that Hellenic Civil War and Corcyra and Athens, how did that civil war end? Because that's also what Thucydides is about. Now, you'll find that answer is not in Thucydides. We leave Corcyra and we leave Thucydides when the world is still upside down. Now, I want to explore how the world remedied itself. And so that's not in Thucydides. That requires further exploration of what happened in Athens that allowed them to resolve all these conflicts internally and allow them to end the civil war and to end it in the most amicable type of resolution that could be achieved.
I know that what what we're going to launch into is going to be big and it's going to be important. So that's why I want to take just less than a minute now to cut away with the fantastic conversation with Adam Townsend here, talking about how Thucydides can help us understand and explain to ourselves what's going on this particular moment. And there's so much more to ask. I told you we're only going to get to a fraction of what I want to speak about with Adam. But if you're watching on YouTube, please make the jump with us. We're going exclusively to Epoch TV, and as you can see, you don't want to miss a second of the great Adam Townsend. It's fantastic. We'll see you in a second. Make the jump back to Epoch TV exclusively.
Help yourself. I'm not really sure how long this whole exercise is supposed to last.
A lot of you have read his books. You may even have watched a movie.
No, I don't even think of him that way. He's old.
Lately, he has become the co-editor of a brand new magazine called County Highway.
We had a 10,000-word piece about traveling to see a Taylor Swift concert. You know, we have stories about everything from the wheat harvest in Kansas to, you know, an animal attack in Iowa to, the barroom storytelling in the current issue of a bunch of old cowboys in Elko, Nevada.
This is a magazine about America in the form of a 19th century newspaper.
It exists only as a newspaper, and it's the only one in the sense that we treat the country as a giant small town. We are one big family. We're back. Words That Matter is back. Adam Townsend is back. I had to cut him off. I feel terrible about it because there's so much to get to, but I'm going to take the opportunity because we have to get some of this. Adam, I have to ask you about the present. What is the most important thing that Thucydides can help us understand about our present moment?
I think Thucydides is part of a solution. I think you have to look at the times we're going through right now. I think there's several books and several historians that help us, and several political scientists. And Thucydides is a vital one because, you know, all of history begins with the Peloponnesian War. Human history kind of begins then. Now there's history before then, but it's not as well chronicled. It's not as well documented, authored, or narrated, nor do you have those exciting characters. I mean, for anybody first discovering Thucydides, when you read about Alcibiades, you're like, wow, this is remarkable. There are remarkable people in human history that are just, even they cross the transom thousands of years, they cross that chasm and they just seem real and vibrant. And then there's periods of Pericles and his funeral oration where you're just amazed. Some historians will argue about, you know, the actual words that were used, and I don't think that those are helpful for me to engage in those type of arguments because I don't desire to be academic, to be so thoroughly academic that I'm qualified to argue with myself about kind of the nuances of this word or that word, or, you know, what he said versus Plato or Aristotle, or the point is that Thucydides was able to tell that history, right? And that's a very, very important thing because memory itself is so fragile. So he was able to recreate that history so that we can understand it now and understand how human behavior, how egos, how vanities influence history. I think it's just remarkable, but he's only one piece. You know, I know that it would be great to focus on just that one piece, but then off of the pages of Thucydides is, again, how did Athens resolve its own civil war? And this is very important because we know that they killed Socrates. But why did they kill Socrates? Reason Socrates was killed, and historians can argue about kind of the dates and the taste of the hemlock. Nonetheless, one element of the reason they killed him is because they needed some type of a resolution to history. The past is kind of a cultural creation, right? History is this type of cultural creation. It's something that we all have to share. Their perception of it was they needed to kind of put away all the remnants, all the relics of that past, because they needed to move on. And there were new laws that were introduced, but there were it wasn't just laws that were introduced. It was also just kind of a type of an agreement, some forcefully brought in, nonetheless, about how people could kind of restore their lives and coexist. So I think that that's very interesting, and that's off the pages of Thucydides. So one of the things that you discover when you're reading Thucydides is you want to learn more about this one specific thing, and those can only be discovered off the pages of Thucydides and onto some of the academic works that have been written about Thucydides and about those specific things. So there's lots of good academic work that was written about how the Athenian civil wars resolved themselves, how the Athenian conflict resolved themselves, but then also how it pertains to where we are now. Is it's civil wars can only really resolve themselves. Well, one of the things that led to the resolution that disrupted the disruption of the civil war was their prosperity. Athens was very prosperous, so it was people wanted to kind of resume that prosperity and enjoy that prosperity. But now what we have happening is we have all that prosperity being sucked out of us. So it's difficult for it's easier to resolve those type of conflicts in times of prosperity.
I'm sorry. Let me ask you: how is the prosperity being sucked out of us now? I'm not debating. I just want you. Because you're a finance person. You know about this. So
yeah. Well, I mean, there's many vehicles that are being employed. I mean, greed has never had so many ways to express itself, right? And it does seem as though that's globalism. A mad rush. Right. It's not necessarily just globalism. It's those things that other people. And again, this is how I have to tell myself a story. So really, what you're seeing now is kind of excerpts of the story that I tell myself. But greed can always be contained. It just has to be contained with threat of being beheaded, right? There.
All right.
There's a very high. Well, it's true, right? I mean, one of the things that the bureaucrats have done is they've ended the way we encounter wars, so that it doesn't disrupt our own type of. They've solved the permanence of their own power, right? They've solved the impermanence of their own power. So as much wars as they're engaged in, we're also that distant away from the wars. We can see with Israel, as we can see with Ukraine, as we can see with Azerbaijan and so many other parts of the world. We're very distantly removed from them, so that it doesn't cause any type of a turnover in our own political systems. So, but I would say Thucydides is important, going back to that for a moment. And I want to be responsive to your question about sucking the wealth out of the middle class. To understand Thucydides can't just be done in isolation. You also have to understand Machiavelli and kind of his opening chapters within Discourses on Livy, which is a remarkable book, and kind of about the political systems that have managed people, the political operating systems that have managed people, and how easily they kind of swing to extremes, but they do so kind of almost imperceptibly until it hits you in the head. And so we're at that now. So we're at a point where the elites feel very unrestrained. So I would describe it kind of as when the Tarquins were vanquished from ancient Rome, and all of a sudden, when they were vanquished, the elites no longer felt constrained at all, right? They now were settling all the old scores. So this is the same thing that actually happened in Corcyra. When the restraints are removed, people kill each other, right? That's what they do. They settle old scores. There's vengeance. So part of what makes, in order to understand Thucydides, you have to also understand Machiavelli and what he wrote in chapter 7 of The Prince. I get kind of technical with this, but which is about one of the things that also changed my life was when he wrote about the Borgias killing Ramiro de Orca, right? Do you remember that? Where the people wake up in the morning. Yeah. Where people wake up in the morning and Ramiro de Orca has been cut in half, and there's a spectacle to that. So part of one of the things I'm interested in is the creative uses of violence in the transformation of society, right? And how violence is employed as spectacle, and as an awe, and also as kind of a notification that times have changed. And so there's this kind of a stream, right? There's a stream that I think everything begins with Thucydides because of the way he told his story. And then we look at Xenophon, and we look at other authors, other historians, historiographers, I suppose, and how they chose to tell their story. And then we come up to Machiavelli. And then we also have to understand all of this, right? Thucydides cannot be understood in isolation, which is a good thing, right? Then we come up even to the book 3 of the origins of totalitarianism, right? Isn't that the book by Hannah Arendt? Book 3. All of these things, I think, are Thucydides, right? It's just a kind of a continuation.
Because we're running out of time. We got a couple of minutes left. So I'm definitely going to get an answer out of this one. Why is Hannah Arendt, I can see what you're pointing at, but why is Hannah Arendt, why are these continuations of Thucydides? What starts with Thucydides that we are engaged in right now? I guess that's what you're saying. There's a timeline starting with Thucydides. There's Hannah Arendt. There's Machiavelli. All of these people who are trying to explain their own present moments to themselves. And that's the project that you and I and our viewers and everyone needs to be engaged with themselves, telling themselves, explaining to themselves what's happening in this moment. Is that the project we're all engaged in?
Well, you said that you thought it would be easy for me to answer that one. I can't say I quite understand the question, but
no, I didn't say it was going to be easy. I said I was going to have to put it to you. Yeah.
I think we all, George Soros, right, has a theory. It's called, and forget about the social parts of George Soros. That's a different conversation, right? Just in terms of one kind of artifact of his is what he calls a theory of reflexivity, right? Which is very interesting. Which is this kind of a theory that he even used to dislocate Bank of England and to dislocate finances, and we see it being used now. But it's built upon kind of Karl Popper, right? And one of the things he talks about is disequilibrium, how to preserve unnatural states of disequilibrium, right? And we're enduring that now. So we also have to understand what's happening now. What's happening now is this constant episodes and cycles of disequilibrium where so the elites, part of the tactics in their kind of perpetual war, right, against us, is this state of disequilibrium to kind of disarm their opposition, to demoralize, humiliate, and disarm their opposition. And they're using this endless, very robust disequilibrium so that people aren't allowed to think. And, there's so much in it, but I want to answer your question in kind of parts. This part that I'm describing now is that the mind can only hold a few different thoughts at a time. The mind is not perfect, but it can perfectly hold about 6 or 7 thoughts in its frontal lobe at a time. So the media is really trying to influence what thoughts those are and whose ownership those thoughts are. They would like to have complete ownership of those thoughts. So they are constantly bombarding our frontal lobe with what they want us to think about. And that does not give us a lot of real estate. That does not leave a lot of real estate over for our own use and recreation. So we have to be very, very careful knowing that so much of our senses are being bombarded and is unfortunately out of our own control, right? That the remaining pieces we have to guard zealously, and part of that is having a kind of a safe space to retreat to in our own mind. So now that we're in our own mind, hopefully we're all meditating, or we're all in contemplation, and we've been instructed in meditation. But part of that is, again, how we tell ourselves a story. So part two of my answer to your question is, Thucydides is kind of the foundation, because he tells us how to tell ourselves a story that has a tremendous amount of complexity. There's a tremendous amount of complexity that's in his story, and some of that complexity can only be discovered once you kind of explore off the pages of Thucydides about the Corcyraean Civil War and the Athenian Civil War. But then we progress, because now we also have to understand Hannah Arendt. So rather than trying to kind of rediscover what's already been found, rather than us trying to invent the wheel of totalitarianism and how to explain it to ourselves, we see that Hannah Arendt has already done that tremendous amount of effort, and she's done so very economically and elegantly. She's smarter than me, right? All these I'm choosing to read people that I believe are smarter than me. So she's explaining it in a way that is not overwhelmed with big words or fancy thoughts. She's using very simple words to explain very complex, abstract type of things. So one of the things that she explains in book 3 that's also relevant to Thucydides is how to govern a system, how to govern people operating systems. So one of the apparatuses that she looks at is how the Nazis did it. And the Nazis did it by creating parallel bureaucracies. So when they wanted to take over government, rather than just take over and appoint their own people into all those offices in government, which they didn't have the authority to do, what they did is they created parallel organizations, funded and staffed those organizations, and made them essentially supersede the source bureaucracy. So we're seeing that now, even within our own government, where we're seeing these 3-letter agencies become 4-letter agencies. And those 4-letter agencies are kind of quasi-public-private things that actually supersede the source. That, we have these new university entities that are funded through the government dollars that are essentially operating parallel to our own agencies, but that in fact have higher authority and less transparency, so they can operate with a great deal more efficacy. So, again, I know we initiated with Thucydides, but Thucydides has to be understood when we're trying to explore. Well, let me just continue with that then. Thucydides has to be understood so that we can tell ourselves this story. We can't rely on others to tell us this story, because they're telling us their story. What I'm sharing with you right now is I'm telling you my story, right? And how I've kind of gleaned and my perceptions and my insights and where I gathered them from. But I don't want people to know my story. I want people to know their own story. And the only way they can acquire their own story is by reading the works of these exceptional people. Remember, these people were not writing mass paperback books. They were elites. They were writing for elites. They had a very discriminating audience. And at the same time, they were writing knowing that humanity will exist in a few thousand years and humanity will be interested in this time. So I really want to do a good job of talking about this time. They also do something that I think is very interesting, which is they use irony. And irony has to be explored. It can be explored through, Harold Bloom wrote a lot about the ironies. Within Orwell and other people have written about the ironies, these kind of transformative ironies within Thucydides. Again, these are things that can be found off the page, and they should be. I would say that for many people, Plato, which I am not a big Plato person at all. In fact, I'm a little Plato person, is a rabbit hole, because once you've discovered Plato, for many people, it becomes a kind of an addiction, and it's a rabbit hole, and they just keep on digging, right? They just keep on going until ultimately they become a conspiracy theorist.
And I think we could keep going, Adam. As I said, I knew we were only going to hit hit a fraction of what we wanted to cover, but I think the really central thing here is, as you've been saying, what we learned from Thucydides. It's not just about the Peloponnesian War. It's not just about the intra-Hellenic civil wars. It's not just about that particular period. It's also about learning how to structure, how to tell ourselves, how to look at a complex situation, very complex situation, how to look at that and how to explain what's going on now to ourselves and how to discuss it with others. And so, Adam, I thank you very much, so much for being here with us today to help us understand it and to discuss it with us. God bless you. We'll see you soon. And audience, thank you for watching Words That Matter, and we'll see you real soon too. God bless you. I'm Lee Smith. See you in the next episode of Words That Matter.